Good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world right now. And welcome to our second CTP webinar. Today's webinar will be about identifying optimum logistics and manufacturing locations in a disrupted world. We have a special focus today on what Central and Eastern Europe has to offer in 2022 and beyond. My name is Bert Hesselink, and I will be your moderator for the next 60 minutes or so. In my daily job, I'm responsible for market research at CTP. First, COVID-19, then the war in Ukraine. No doubt that we're now living in a disrupted world. Therefore, good insights from experts are more important than ever when making strategic location decisions. Therefore, I'm very pleased that we've got some great speakers lined up for you today that I would like to introduce to you right now. We have Rob Hall, International Partner Global Occupier Services at Cushman Wakefield. Rob has got more than 33 years of experience in advising companies on location decisions. Cushman Wakefield is one of the world's largest real estate services firms. Secondly, Henri Viswat, CEO at Randstad Poland. Randstad is the world's largest HR services provider and advises companies on anything that has to do with labor and talent. And last but not least, Kamil Blažek, partner at Kinstellar. Kinstellar are one of the leading independent law firms in emerging Europe and Central Asia, and Kamil personally has advised many international companies on investments, mergers, and acquisitions throughout Central and Eastern Europe. In order for you to get the most out of this webinar today, we've turned off your microphones and videos. However, please ask questions by using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, not the chat function, at any time during the webinar. We will respond to your questions during the Q&A sessions at the end of today's webinar. Only we as hosts can see your questions coming in, and we will not mention your name or your company name, so your anonymity is guaranteed. The entire session will be recorded and the slides will be shared with you immediately afterwards. Our program today, that will consist of three parts. The main part will be the presentation by Rob Hall, and Rob will paint us a picture of our disrupted world before we will then start focusing in on Central and Eastern Europe. Rob's presentation will be followed by a question and answer session with our other main speakers. For today, that's Henri Viswat and Kamil Blažek. And for the last 15 minutes, we will open up the webinar to questions from you. Okay, before I will hand over the word to Rob for the main presentation, I would still like to quickly make use of this opportunity and say a few words about CTP. CTP was founded at the end of the 90s with a vision to be a reliable professional real estate partner for companies investing in Central and Eastern Europe. And the proposition back then, and it still is today, is to be the provider of modern, high-quality representative buildings during the lifetime of companies' investments into the region, and to also provide sufficient space for future growth. So in order to keep these promises to our clients, our policy is that we in principle do not sell our buildings. And also we make sure that we always have enough space for future growth of our clients by developing and managing fully serviced parks with multiple buildings and many amenities. So it started out with one building in the middle of the Czech Republic about 23 years ago, has since then grown into a network of 125 business parks, portfolio of more than 8 million square meters of warehouse space, plus a land bank of 18 million square meters that's available for the growth of our clients. Our business parks are located all across Central and Eastern Europe, plus Austria, Germany, and the Netherlands. We're renting out our buildings to about 750 companies, and here you can see a selection of some of our biggest clients. Most of the companies that you see on this slide are in multiple locations, and they're in more than one country, and most of our growth actually comes from our existing clients as well. At the moment, we have about 1,140,000 square meters under construction, out of which the majority of the space is already pre-leased to our existing clients. So basically, we grow when our clients are growing, and this is why we're so much interested in the success of our clients. Therefore, in addition to providing traditional real estate solutions, we're also supporting our clients in meeting their sustainability goals, and we help them to integrate into local communities and to connect them to other businesses, schools, universities, and authorities. So in addition to investing into our own people, including park managers, community managers, we're also investing into physical infrastructure, for example, by adding clubhouses to our largest parks. These clubhouses, they typically facilitate the building of communities, and they help us to build successful business ecosystems together with our clients and in support of the success of our clients. Okay, I think that's about enough about CTP for now. So let's move on to the main presentation of today. And I would like to hand over the word to Rob Hall of Cushman Wakefield to show us the disruption, but that it can also create opportunities, especially in Central and Eastern Europe. Rob, over to you now.
Thank you, Bert, and it's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon or this morning or this evening, wherever you are. I'm sitting in London, and as Bert said, I oversee our logistics and industrial occupier platform across Europe. It's a mighty big subject to cover in a 20-minute session, but we'll give it a go. So, Bert, if you could turn to the next slide, please. I thought a bit of context to Europe would be a good starting point. Three characters you may recognise. On the left, Victor Hugo, who in the mid-1800s talked about future cooperation between the US and Europe. On the right-hand side, Winston Churchill, wartime leader of the UK, who talked about Europe having a complex history, but using conflict to work towards harmony as the future depended on it. Wise words indeed. And then finally in the middle, Barack Obama, who stated that perhaps the US did not quite fully appreciate the impact and influence of Europe in leading the world. So there's a bit of context to the continent of Europe. As we turn to the next slide, a few thoughts and themes on the world. And as I talk, just have a glance through them and have a look at the ones that are prevalent or indeed relevant to you and the roles that you perform. Indeed, they're situations in which governments are acting, trade flows are responding to, and certainly from an occupier perspective, occupiers are reacting to. But now consider this. As we turn to the next slide, these comments were predicted 25 years ago in Wired magazine, in an article called The Long Boom, A History of the Future. And Bert, if you just turn back a slide, and now you can absorb these comments in a bit more detail. It's amazing how in 1997, so many of the areas outlined here have come to fruition. They talked about a complex relationship between China and the US. They even talked about a modern day plague impacting the world. They also talked about a global ecological crisis, a climate crisis, if you like, impacting global food supplies. And also, but perhaps notably, they didn't get everything right, because on the left there, you will see they mentioned technology. And I think it's fair to say we'd all agree that technology has had a positive impact in the world of manufacturing and logistics and automation. But just an interesting reflection that maybe some people can see into the future. So if we turn to the next slide, Bert, and then the next slide, just a quick reference point for the logistics and industrial clients that we at Cushman Wakefield act for. As you can see, they come from across aviation, automotive, supply chain, retail, and logistics. But I think the point here is that this gives us an incredible optic on the way occupiers are thinking, how they're addressing taking cost out, how they're addressing expansion, and in recent times over COVID, how they've been reacting to the pandemic. And those clients represent 2.3% of global GDP. So it's a real insight into all the thoughts and thinking and optics of an occupier. So let's turn to the next slide, please, Bert. Europe, it's really complicated. And I'm guessing many of the people on this call today actually sit within Europe and will understand and appreciate that. But if we turn to the next slide, please, Bert. This slide on the left of the screen, I think is really quite extraordinary, because what it shows is that not everybody's in Schengen, not every country's in the Eurozone, not every country is within EU, and not every country is within NATO. So it's a complex patchwork of slightly different interests and perspectives on how we view economic growth, how we view security, and so on. And we'll all have read in the press over the last 24 hours or so that both Sweden and Finland have applied to join NATO as well. So again, this map may well need updating. And on the right-hand side, nobody needs telling about the refugee situation, which is impacting Europe, and some extraordinary statistics, which I'm sure my co-panelists will come on to speak about in due course. But the stat that I found most amazing was the population of Warsaw increasing by about 17% over the past 6 or 7 weeks. So as we move to the next slide, please, Bert, we look at global GDP. And I think as a response to the growth in global GDP, I think it's interesting to just acknowledge how the different big economies are reacting to global infrastructure, which is driving our connectivity, or lack of connectivity if disruption comes into play. So the 10T program in Europe, in the middle cluster there, if you like, that has a budget of 300 billion euros. The global gateway of infrastructure and 10T projects, looking at cohesion and sustainability in transport and interconnection. But of course, the US is not to be outdone, and Biden has looked to boost their own internal infrastructure with $1 trillion program. And then China, over to the east, dwarfs both budgets with plans to improve their infrastructure to the tune of $2.3 trillion. So we've got the regional perspective of trying to improve their own internal infrastructure to drive their own internal trade and movement of goods. I think it's also in this slide useful to just look at the populations of the world, and there are 750 million people in Europe alone. But interestingly, from the relevance of Central Europe, it is the biggest sub-region with 150 million people. It has an extraordinarily large, growing in terms of consumption, volume of opportunity ahead of it. But just keeping to global GDP, today, the global economy is $94 trillion. Now, if we go back 52 years, it was 3 trillion. Now, you can see how global supply chain has actually brought that together. And notwithstanding that, if you believe the predictions, and predicting is difficult, as we learned in the first couple of slides, or is it easy, if you like, on the first couple of slides, over the next 30 years, the GDP could double. So we're looking at more growth in the economy. Is that more movement of goods, more consumer consumption, and so on? So global trade and movement of is not going away, despite current blips, inflationary rises, and so on. And in Europe, about a quarter of the economy is manufacturing, logistics, and agriculture. So the purpose of us all in this call talking about logistics and manufacturing, it is a quarter of the economy in Europe. So, Bert, if we just turn to the next slide and we just focus in on Central Europe for a moment, maybe a complex slide of hexagons, if you like, but if you imagine each hexagon is 0.1% of global GDP. If I tell you that New York is 20 hexagons and that Munich's metro area is 3 hexagons, you can get a sense of the scale. But I think the important thing about the Central European economy, it's not just naturally for growing its own domestic industry and services and so on, it's how it services the surrounding markets and geographies. And I think in terms of the war in the Ukraine, where everybody has not only felt the human impact, but also the impact of supply chain disruption. I think Central Europe is at a crossroads where Russia supplies the grade neon for chip production, also the key nutrients for fertilizers. And it was announced yesterday by the United Nations that global food prices have gone up 30%. And one of the reasons for this, of course, is Russia and Ukraine are the breadbasket of the world and provide 30% of the world's wheat. And currently Ukraine has 20 million tons of wheat sitting there from last year's harvest, which is unable to head to the ports. So Central Europe, a significant economy in its own right. So as we turn to the next slide, please, Bert, let's just have a quick look at the market overview. And the next slide, please, Bert, is a bar chart. No presentation is complete without one. And I'm not going to go through the details of this apart from pointing out the obvious, that all the charts are going up. On the left, you see US take up. On the right, you see European take up. Record levels in both of those markets. Anecdotally, it is said that global demand went up 60% last year. Statista have said there are 150,000 warehouses in the world. I don't know who counted them, but they are forecasting another 30,000 warehouses are required globally in the next 3 years to meet global consumption. If you also look at the fact that the US, with a smaller population, is actually got more than double the amount of square meters of warehouse space than Europe. Admittedly, its personal consumption is higher, but equally, there's an argument to say that Europe, even without the current supply chain challenges and supply of building challenges, is understocked. Okay, so just in terms of the market, talking to my colleagues on the ground in Central Europe, they're recording that demand activity is still healthy, although has slowed a bit in March and April as companies take stock of the war in the Ukraine and what it means. And there's a slight recalibration of what should we do next? How should we proceed? But equally, with retail supply chain, retail omnichannel diversification, and the manufacturing sector hitting e-mobility and the new area in the automotive sector, interest is still very much there, but is just taking a little bit of a breather during the current war. I think, therefore, sentiment remains positive. And why is Central Europe well placed? Well, it's got cost advantages over Western Europe, and that perhaps goes without saying. It's got cheaper real estate, it's got cheaper labour. Places like the Czech Republic have incredible industrial heritage with brownfield sites looking to come forward, which are obviously more desirable perhaps than greenfield sites. And there is the incredible automotive sector, Skoda in the Czech, Kia, PSA, VW and JLR and so on in Slovakia. And there is interest from the Far East in gigafactories and meeting the new sort of component elements, if you like, batteries mainly for the automotive sector. So as we turn to the next slide, please, Bert. This is a proprietary algorithm from Cushman Wakefield. It requires a lot longer than a minute or so to describe it. But if you like, it assesses matters on conditions, risk, and cost. And you can weigh the percentages of those as to how your company or your corporate would like to prioritize those factors. But if you look at cost and you prioritize cost as a factor, the lighter the color, the green and the amber, if you like, the more desirable that geographical location is. So if cost is your driver, Central Europe is extremely well placed. So Bert, if you could move on, please, to the next slide. What's on the mind of the occupier? Well, I'm not going to go through this list, and I'm sure there aren't really many surprises in this list for you. But what I will do is just give you a couple of anecdotes. Climate and climate incidents. I mean, climate incidents have increased by 5-fold during the last 10 years. We've had clients who say we're not going to go to a zone prone to cyclones or hurricanes or flooding. And if you think about those territories, and we probably know and can guess where they all are, those are now affecting big locational decisions. We've also got under availability some of the challenges that sit around permitting, and this will be something that Bert and the CTP team will know very well. Getting permits is getting harder and harder and is taking longer and longer. And with that come the challenges on raw materials and affordability and so on. But there we are. There's a quick snapshot of what's on the mind of the occupier. If we turn to the next slide, please, Bert. There we are, today's disruptions and future realities. I'm going to touch on supply chain challenges here. There are people on this call who are supply chain specialists, and I'm certainly not going to pretend that I am, but seeing the impact of them with our client base when it comes to real estate, we do see. I'm going to just pick up on the pandemic, which in Europe and the US maybe seems like back over our shoulder. But if you think that in China, equivalent of 3/4 of the population of Europe is currently in lockdown, you've got idle factories, and you've got massive congestion at some of the Chinese ports where containers have been delayed. Currently, they're sitting there for 12 days. Before the lockdown, it was 3 to 4 days. So we're seeing that unpredictability, and we're seeing that in the past, a container would arrive with a 70% chance of arriving on time. Now it's only a 30% chance of arriving on time. What does this mean for real estate? Well, to say nearshoring is maybe too easy. It may be a snapshot reaction, or do you know what? It might just become reality over a 5 to 10 year planning program, and that's how long it's going to take to re-gear networks. But there is certainly an argument that is the chance for a number of occupiers. In a recent Financial Times survey, there were about 370 occupiers, European occupiers, who were in China, and about 70% of them said they were considering bringing some of the functions back to Europe to shorten their supply chains. So I guess for those supply chain managers whose job perhaps in the past was managing the predictable, it's now the almost impossible task of trying to predict the unpredictable. And the shorter the supply chain, maybe, just maybe, the easier that may be. Just a thought on automotive. VW, as an example, and it's the same for most of the manufacturers, a car may have 40,000 different components, and it may have 200 to 300 suppliers bringing those components in. If you can take some of the stress out of that supply chain and bring it nearer, it may just be helpful. So as we turn towards the close, Bert, if you could just flick on to sustainability, the biggest issue perhaps of them all. Some real challenges there in terms of the supply chain. Some of our clients who are clearly looking at the real estate impact of their buildings and carbon footprint, but in that supply chain world, something like 95% of the carbon footprint of their operation actually sits in making and moving goods rather than the real estate footprint itself. But that's not to underestimate the built environment's impact on pollution as well. And we all know that that is about 40% of carbon footprint is real estate in its wider context. But I think when we move on into scope 3 of sustainability, it's not regulatory yet, but it's perhaps a direction of travel where companies are having to look at their whole supply chain and measure the carbon footprint of it. That is when perhaps shorter supply chains may also be a sustainable advantage. And just saying that's not regulatory, but I suspect that is a direction of travel where you have to measure everything else, if you like, indirect in your supply chain. And typically that will be 11 times more than your own direct carbon impact. So the final slide to conclude, Bert, is really just drawing it all together. And what does it all mean? Well, there are challenges, absolute challenges: rising costs, raw materials, limited supply, rising rents, and so on and so forth. And they're not to be underestimated. But it's also fair to say those challenges are global, they're not regional. So they are an impact that everybody is trying to have to navigate. The supply chain management is key. And also, I think as a steer, keeping flexible and keeping agile are the cornerstone really to success. So in terms of the opportunities, Central Europe undoubtedly remains a cost-effective location. It is and provides incredible goods, services over the borders into Western Europe to drive particularly Germany's manufacturing industries. It has incredible infrastructure, which has global gateway funding to boost it. And whilst we are in challenging times at the moment, I think for the region as Europe and for Central Europe, as we look to the medium term, we do have good cause to be reasonably optimistic. But thank you.
Thank you, Rob. Yeah, we're living in very turbulent times. But yeah, thank you for the still quite a some positive conclusions for Central and Eastern Europe. One of the conclusions that you maybe on purpose left out is the people question, and that's why I'm very happy that we have Henri Viswat of Randstad as one of our experts on this webinar as well. And yeah, Rob, you were talking about GDP, forecasted GDP growth from, what did you say, 94 trillion right now to doubling it in the next 30 years.
Correct, yeah.
We will need people for that. So, and this is a question and a challenge that many companies are coping with today, pretty much anywhere in the world, pretty much anywhere in Europe. And so they turn to, I guess, Randstad, to you, Henri. And because we're living in such turbulent times, I mean, any data that comes out is typically already is old. So how do you make sense of what's happening now in the world, and how do you advise your clients?
Thanks for asking that question, Bert, and thanks for having me. Maybe it's good that I flagged that we are already present for almost 3 decades in the Central Eastern European market, and besides that already for 60 years on the total market. But it means that we have a lot of interesting data. We do a lot of research. We have our own research departments, of course, that come up with a lot of data. And that's the data that we use to also advise our clients, Bert. And maybe it's also good to flag before we go into more detailed questions that we only have time to talk about some high over trends. But we made a summary available for the participants in this webinar that is containing detailed information from several different researches that we are doing at the moment and that we already did for years. So we can also track the trends there, and it will be available for the participants to answer some more detailed questions if they want to.
Yeah, we'll make this available at the end of the, after the webinar, together with the slides, by the way.
Exactly.
Yeah, big question that you're based in Warsaw, Poland, and Rob was showing in one of his slides that we're talking about close to 5 million refugees, and that the population in Warsaw alone, I think Rob mentioned, increased by 17%. This is all terrible, of course. What do you make of this flow of people when it comes to the labor market? What are the opportunities? What are the threats? Can you say something more about that?
Yes, of course. Yeah, what's interesting to see is that, especially after the first crisis, I would say that we had here in Central Eastern Europe, of course, being the pandemic, we saw quite a strong V-shaped recovery already in the first year. So the demand for labor, but also the investments started up quite quickly after the beginning of the pandemic. So strong demand still, a lot of investors coming to Poland, huge demand for staff, but at the same time, what we see is that there is an impact of the post-pandemic times, because what we see is that there's a strong turnover. A lot of employees are leaving their employers. It started at the beginning of 2021, and it's really interesting to see that this is really driven by the dissatisfaction of people in their employers. And of course, that was initiated by the uncertainty that we had because of the pandemic times. And so there was wage stagnation, employers didn't know what to do, people were losing their jobs, moving from one industry to another industry to never return to the original profession that they had. So there was a shift on the market. So rotation is a really big issue for companies at the moment. And at the same time, we see that, that of course, the inflation that's happening on the market is also increasing the wages. And that, again, is together with the uncertainty on the market, not helping in satisfying those people. So that's one of the trends that we see. Scarcity is still high. So there is an overheated labor market. And our first idea was, when the Ukrainian situation started, let's see what the impact will be of the inflow of all those new people. But the reality is that Ukrainian men, let's not forget that we already had 1 million Ukrainian men working in Poland, for example, before the war started to leave to defend their home country. And the refugees that are entering the market at the moment are mainly women with children. And they are not always connected to the demand on the market, right? So they are not all fit to work, especially in strong physical work in production and logistics. And at the same time, they have children. So it needs time. We predict, by the way, that not all of the people that have entered Poland will go back to Ukraine. And of course, the first question is whenever that will happen, right? Because the situation is still not under control. And it might take a long time. And what we see and what we predict is, of course, the longer it will take, the more people probably will stay. So from that perspective, there will probably be more labor available on the market in the coming year. But that's, let's say, a short-term impact that we see, and it's not easy to predict what will be the long-term effect there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's difficult to predict the future, of course. And it's not great for Ukraine that some people will stay in the countries that they are fleeing to. And I would imagine that this probably includes perhaps the more higher educated people. So you could sort of talk even about a sort of brain drain from Ukraine to Central and Eastern Europe. But this brain drain is actually also happening in Central and Eastern Europe to some extent. I guess the higher educated people may go to Western Europe. What's your experience in how countries or cities or governments are dealing with this brain drain? And what are they doing to stop this? And are there any differences between the countries as well and how they deal with this?
Well, first of all, of course, this is a big challenge. And I think this brain drain is not only connected anymore to people leaving the country. Because what we see as one of the trends after the pandemic is that remote work is the new normal. It's the new standard even. So that means that if you talk about especially IT staff, so big R&D plants, for example, big R&D departments, are being more and more staffed by global teams that are just working remotely and that are virtually connected through the internet, right? So this brain drain is, from that perspective, something that's really inevitable, I would say. On the other hand, it also starts with the education. And so how are countries, let's say, capable of adding more and more qualified staff to their economy? And that's something that we see, especially in Poland, where I'm located. We have a lot of good and qualified universities. And we see that the government is really focusing on this. Yeah, that's what we see.
And that's an interesting point, actually, where if you talk about Poland, or we see it in the Czech Republic as well, is that the countries are trying to transition from, let's say, an assembly type of country to a country where higher added value jobs are done. So, but there's a lot of talk about it, I see. But to which extent, based on your experience, is it realistic for these countries, for these regions, for these cities to assume that they will be successful in attracting companies that add more value to their products and require higher skilled people?
Yeah.
How good are they? How realistic is this, basically? Because if this is not going to happen successfully, then sort of like the western part of Central and Eastern Europe may get lost in the middle.
True. Yeah, and that's strange, because on the one hand it is happening. So, for example, you see big companies like Samsung that have huge R&D departments in Warsaw, for example. But we also see it in Hungary, and we also see it in Czech. Also, a bit of the lower job profiles, so the big shared service centers where we add value. So that's not production and logistics, but this is really skilled labor that we are talking about. But on the other hand, of course, what needs to happen, and that's more like a political thing, is are we going to make the countries in Central and Eastern Europe more attractive for people to move to? If you are a big brand, you can use your brand to be attractive. So there are even people moving from France, the UK, and Germany to Poland because they want to work for brands like Samsung, for example. At the same time, we see that inclusivity, and nationalism, there's friction. We see that in Poland, we see that in Hungary, and that makes the countries here in Central European also less attractive to move to. So I think that that's also a question that I see from investors and big companies that are really lobbying and pushing on the government to make the country more inclusive, because that's where the young talent is focused on.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Maybe it's a good time to also move to Kamil, because Kamil is advising many companies, investors, on making acquisitions or investing into Central and Eastern Europe, and how they are looking at the region. But before we get into that, I would like to ask you, Kamil, first maybe a bit more of a personal question with regards to the war in Ukraine. I mean, last year, your company, Kinstellar, you grew your office before the war in Kiev quite significantly, and I believe it was and is one of your largest offices in the region. How have your operations been affected by the war?
Yeah. Thanks, Bert, and hi everyone, and thanks for the question and for being here. Actually, it's a sort of very relevant question. As you said, I mean, we do have actually 11 offices in 11 countries, and in fact, at the moment, our Kiev office is the largest operation we have in a given country. We have at the moment over 100 staff in Kiev, around Kiev, and actually some of the female colleagues, I think around 30 of them are actually abroad, be it in Czech Republic, Hungary, Slovakia, in one of our other offices, or actually in the US or Canada. And of course, it was great, very significant and harmful impact on the operations. But the good fact is, we are actually continuing working. We have actually reopened our office in Kiev as well after a while, when all the people work from home or from elsewhere. And I just have to say that our people are doing just great in Kiev. Both those that are actually to some extent being involved in the territorial defense or anywhere else in the army, or those that are continuing to work and are available for our clients. The work changed a bit. There are no transactions really in Ukraine, but there is actually some dispute resolution work, contentious work, insurance, and others. So the life has not stopped, but obviously it was a major impact. And we try to help our colleagues in Ukraine as much as we can. And there's also great level of solidarity among firms in Western Europe for Ukrainian lawyers, and obviously also in Central Europe. And I'm very I think it's a great result of the solidarity. If you look at Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, Moldova, and the Czech Republic, a lot of really massive amount of people helping the Ukrainians. I think that's one of the few positive experiences that we can see actually in the current situation.
Well, it's good that your colleagues are back into the office again in Kiev. Hopefully they can stay there. Going back to the question or the point that that Henri was making about basically a little bit about politics, Poland, Czech Republic, Hungary. You're advising many companies when they are coming to the region. What are your clients' views on risks and worries they have in Central and Eastern Europe, and how do they differentiate between the countries, and has something changed since the war?
Well, starting from the very end of your question, I mean, obviously things changed since the war, but I think it's it's so short period of time. It's really difficult to generalize. I think it's more really people and companies watching out for what's going to happen, and implementing crisis scenarios. And I don't think they have that much. That there was not really, obviously outside of Ukraine, that there was not a huge change in terms of making differences between the countries compared to the situation before the war started. And now, before the war started, I think, what is the view of our clients, of the major corporates, either regional or the global ones on the region? When we talk to them, I mean, obviously the situation changed to something like 20 years ago and 10 years ago. It's people often forget and look 2-3 years back only. But if you remember what we were discussing with our clients 20 years ago and 10 years ago, there's a major difference to perception of CEE as a not only safe and profitable destination for investment, but in fact as a developed destination for investment, as a country and number of countries where you can compare it with number of regions, whether it's in Asia, South America, Africa, or elsewhere, where you can't really tell much difference to the rest of the European countries. So, and that goes both for the overall economic conditions, for the tax policies, for legal protection, and or for the stability of the infrastructure. So, I think overall, and obviously we do work for clients, in the countries differ from Czech Republic, Slovakia, Poland, and Hungary being the core stable of the stable investment markets in Central Europe. Of course, they are 10, maybe 15 years ahead of Southeast Europe, Balkan countries. If I speak with our clients and my colleagues in our Serbian office, Croatian office, or Bulgaria, Romania, of course there are you do see the same type of investment or similar type of investment that was coming to Central Europe 15 years ago, and so there is a difference. I would say perhaps first wave countries and second wave countries, but in both. In all of those countries, it's a really significant change to the perception and to the level of risk perception by our clients, that even if you look just 10 years back.
And if you now, so this was 10 years back, if you now look forward 10 years from now, how do you think that it will have changed then? Or what's your view on the mid to long-term prospects for Central and Eastern Europe?
Well, I think they are, now if we speak about the countries that are in the EU, and I think that there is a significant difference in terms of, legal, regulatory, investment safety perception, and perhaps I would add that I really very much hope that we will have in 10 years Ukraine and Serbia in the EU as well, and I think that will be a great addition both to the EU but also to CE countries. You know, having actually Ukraine really being in one economic bloc with us would add a lot to the development of the region, and I do see this actually as a huge opportunity, not only in terms of the overall security, but actually much more in the terms of the economic development. So, assuming this would happen, well, I would say that in 10 years from now, and I hope people would not actually refer to Central Europe as Eastern Europe, as they often do still, and they would also not really. I think that what some of the other guys on the webinar said. I think we will see that the Central European countries will certainly be much more popular for very educated, high net sort of earning professionals from Western Europe and from elsewhere in the world to move in, because the quality of life, which is, for me, in all of the countries, very good or excellent, will sort of just increase, and there will be more opportunities and perhaps a bit more entertaining life than in Western Europe. That's sort of what I think. Mm-hmm. I mean, looking on you, Bert, I mean, you are living here for many years, and you come from the Netherlands, right? So
yeah, let's not go there. But yeah, I'm still here, and the quality of life is great. And the whole region is so incredibly interesting because there's so many differences, and that's why I keep asking the question now as well. What are there any differences between the countries? Because I do know that there are many differences between countries, and as Rob was saying, Europe, it's complicated, I think he was saying. Good, we've got about 15 minutes left in this webinar, so I would like to turn to questions from the audience. Here is a good one. Rob, at Cushman's, you like to use your tagline, "What's next?" So what's next for CEE?
What a good question. What's next? I think self-assurity, maturity, and I think if you're to sort of capture it, I think embracing the new manufacturing side coming through the automotive sector. And I'm talking with the gigafactories and the e-mobility and so on and so forth. I think in terms of e-commerce, which I didn't really touch upon because it's covered in so many other arenas as a subject, but there's still enormous growth to come from Central Europe in terms of e-commerce. If you take sort of a blended average across Europe of sort of 18%, although it does vary from country to country, I think there's a lot more e-commerce growth to come through Central Europe. And that's not just international, that's from domestic retailers as well. And I also sort of buy into the fact of the added value engineering, not just perhaps traditionally the foundation of manufacturing itself, but now the added value element and the assembly element. I think there's great opportunities with the skilled workforce to build upon that as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, here is an interesting question because it's also, we are so far, it's all quite positive, but it's also because we were focusing on the mid to long term. Here is a question that is more focused on the short term. The war hit just as it seemed the great disruption of COVID looked like it was winding down. Have negotiations for lease deals and investment transactions have been disrupted equally across CEE countries? And are end users as likely to have put lease deals on hold as investors involved in acquisitions? To any of you. Maybe Rob or Kamil, as your, actually to all three of you, like, what's your experience? Have investors put projects on hold or not? Or the opposite is true, maybe speeding it up.
Yeah, if I just start with perhaps I will leave the least question to Rob, because I mean that's I think but in terms of the acquisitions, and I think that's what I can really see. Actually, there is actually it's really not slowing down. It's actually I think in all the countries we do see there are sometimes difficulties in financing, and if you look to some countries which sort of that were more hit by financial crisis connected with the war, then of course that has slowed down. But generally, the appetite for actually buying companies is still there. It's actually growing. It's whether it's e-commerce, whether it's energy companies, whether it's manufacturing companies. I haven't really seen actually a slowdown. We expect it. I sort of always ask the question. I always say, well, actually, it will be coming down to a slowdown, but we don't see it yet.
Mm-hmm.
And I think from an occupier perspective on the leasing side, I mentioned there has been just a slowing down of sentiment while companies just recalibrate what next. But we've also got to bear in mind, we've been through a period of 2 to 3 years with incredible growth and incredible demand. And so, there has been a little softening of that over the past couple of months, undoubtedly. But what we're reporting from the ground is there are very few deals that have aborted at all and cancelled. It's really just taking stock and replanning business plans and operational plans. So I think there is a view, when there is an understanding of what the impact of the war is likely to have on the neighbouring countries, then there will be a recalibration of what will be required.
Mm-hmm. And Henri?
We actually see the same, Bert. Investors' pipelines haven't really slowed down at all. I think the main investors that I'm talking to are really focused on midterm and long-term perspective, right? It's not a short-term decision to come to the Central Eastern European region. And I would also like to remind us of the remark that Robert made, because I think it's a very fair remark also in terms of the labor market. We shouldn't look at the labor market, for example, in isolation. You can get maybe a bit scared because there's an overheated market here. There's a lot of scarcity. There's wage inflation. But on the other hand, we see the same in the western side of Europe. And closing the gap between Central Eastern Europe and Western Europe is not that logical, right? So even though we see this increase in wages and we see the scarcity, we see the same trend in Western Europe. And as a result of that, we still see the same positive impact of moving to Central Eastern Europe. It would, of course, be different if it would be different in the Western part of Europe, but that's not the case. That's also what Robert mentioned. And I think that that is something that is one of the positive drivers of companies to still invest in Central Eastern Europe, building plants and building logistics centers also.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, on the salaries, with regards to inflation as well, how does this compare? Because inflation tends to be a little bit higher in most of Central and Eastern European countries compared to Western Europe, but we're at a lower base in terms of salaries, the cost of some other items, not everything. There's a question here, how to fight against inflation without affecting the economy. We don't have an economist in this webinar. If anyone wants to answer this question. It's a tricky one.
Well, I'm certainly not an economist, but I'll just tell you a layperson's response. I think the inflationary pressures on every country, and they're really not unique to any specific country, they're across the board, are driven fundamentally in the main by, well, food prices, but energy prices at the moment. And I mean, I'm sitting in the UK today and we're at a 40-year high on inflation at 9%. And I think much of Central Europe is sort of hovering in the lower double-digit sort of month-on-month inflation figures. So no, but energy and food prices, I think, is the fundamental cause for that. What the solution is, I will hand to people who are better educated and placed than myself.
If I may to jump with two thoughts on that. I mean, well, I agree. Energy and food prices, but I mean, the other factor that we do see here is people, well, that they haven't sort of spent much money during the COVID times, and there's a huge amount of spending right now, actually, of people being actually afraid of the inflation. And so what I think we really need is the sanity of the political representation of the central banks to sort of really provide continuous sort of education for the people that, in their own behavior, that they are sort of saving, that will cool, they need to cool the economy. And actually, I don't see that much. I think, I see a lot of spending related to the war and to other things, and that is actually only supporting the people in their own spending. So I think that's the one thing. And the other perhaps is, which is easy to say, hard to handle. We could join the euro area. We would possibly have sort of lower inflation, and of course, that would apply to UK in the same way, right?
Okay, let's not continue on this topic right now. We can dedicate a completely different webinar on that topic. Here's a good question. Rob, you were mentioning that 70% of occupiers are looking to shift functions back to Europe to shorten supply chains. Are there any concrete signs you're seeing that these long-term moves are starting to happen? Examples of clients, real.
It's a great question. B, it's a survey from the Financial Times a few weeks ago. And I think it's fair to say from actions to sort of filter through from surveys does take time. And I think, and I hope I said at the time, it's probably a medium to long-term play. But I think the sentiment at the moment is very much some uncertainty. There are trade, there are tariff issues, there are geopolitical issues. And then, as I said, overlay that with sustainability on shortening supply chains. It is certainly something that corporates are thinking about, testing, stress testing, challenging their own internal teams as to whether it would be a good or a bad thing. But I think to answer the question, at the moment, it's very limited, but sentiment does sort of move slowly sometimes into reality. But it's certainly a thought process.
Mm-hmm. And here's a question that's sort of related to it. If you see a difference between how corporates perceive the impact of the war in Ukraine on their investments in Central and Eastern Europe based on where they are from. For example, if UK corporates, for example, looking at the implications differently compared to, for example, companies headquartered in the US, Japan, or China. I mean, in the US, talking about this war in Europe. In the UK, they understand there's actually a difference between Central and Eastern Europe and Western Europe. Do you see differences between in the responses based on where corporates are from?
At the moment, no, simply. And even if they're a US corporate or a corporate from the Far East, the chances are they have a European HQ who will be perhaps attuned to, as we said at the outset, the complexity of Europe. So at the moment, and it's a personal perspective, I've not seen any companies withdrawing from Central Europe or taking any big fundamental decisions in that regard at all, irrespective of which global HQ they have. It's really a case of wait and see, if you like. But I'm not hearing anybody looking to pull out of the region. Absolutely not.
Mm-hmm. Good. We've got 2 minutes left in the webinar, so we've almost reached the end. And I would like to ask one final and the same question to Rob, Henri, and Kamil. The topic of today's webinar was identifying optimum logistics and manufacturing locations in a disrupted world and what Central and Eastern Europe has to offer in 2022 and beyond. And could I ask each one of you to just summarize in 1 or 2 sentences what CEE has to offer to investors in this disrupted world that we are living in today? Rob, can I ask you to start 1 or 2 sentences? What CEE has to offer?
Great infrastructure, tremendous workforce, and opportunity that it's really there to embrace and to seize upon its own internal consumption growth opportunities, but also to feed the Western European sort of consumption from next door.
Great. So there's nothing left for Kamil and Henri.
Sorry.
Henri, if I can ask you, what CEE has to offer?
Maybe to add, by my accent, probably you heard I'm also not from the Central Eastern European region. I'm from the Netherlands, and what's striking for me, also in this crisis, it's a personal observation, but still, is the resilience of the people. If you talk about the workforce, if you talk about everything that's going on, we have highly motivated people, strong commitment, very result-driven. So from that perspective, I think she has a lot to offer.
That's a great one. And Kamil?
Well, I would agree with what Rob said, and I would sort of say on the infrastructure, it's also reliable. And I mean, that's the one thing is, you can always improve, but there is a reliability in the energy infrastructure and others that has been sort of proven. If you look to Southeast Asia or other parts of the world, it's available everywhere. It's not only in those sort of hubs and that's a very important factor. So you really can use the country as a whole. And second thing, from obviously my field, like the legal one, legal stability and safety. Again, looking back 25 years, there's a tremendous difference. And of course, there's a difference between Czech Republic, Bulgaria, and Ukraine in terms of legal safety and enforcement issues, etc. You would not actually really put much difference between Czech Republic and Germany in terms of how fast you get a decision. It's slow as well in Germany, so that's the point. But it's very similar. And in the other countries, they are really, the EU has done a tremendous job. You do have actually 50% of generally laws that impact entrepreneurs and businesses are generally the same in all EU countries. People outside of Europe or even in Europe don't appreciate it. It's really, you play by the same rule book. Of course, it's applied a bit differently in every country, but the general, 95% of the things that you get, you are actually cooking from the same cookbook, and that's important.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, thank you very much for summarizing this this webinar. So I don't have to do that. But we've reached the end of today's webinar, and I'd like to thank our speakers, Henri Viswat of Randstad, Kamil Blažek of Kinstellar, for sharing your time and sharing your insights. And I would like to say a special thank you to Rob Hall for preparing and giving the main presentation of today. This presentation will be shared with you together with the report of Randstad that Henri referred to. And yeah, I'd like to thank you as an audience. Thank you for asking many good questions. Some questions were left unanswered. I will still ask these questions to the speakers, and we'll get back to you by email on that. Keep your eyes and ears open for our next webinar, which will be held during the fall. And I hope that by that time, war is over and that we won't find ourselves in yet another lockdown. Thank you very much for attending, and stay safe. See you next time.
Thank you.